All right, diving right in today, we're looking at something that might seem super basic at first glance. How do researchers actually measure child engagement? It's one of those things everyone thinks they know it when they see it, but it gets kind of complicated.
It does get complicated, yeah. Like we can all picture that classic image of a kid completely absorbed in building a block tower or just mesmerized by a story.
Yeah.
But how do you translate that feeling into hard data for research?
Yeah, that's a really good point. We've got a ton of research to dig into here. A really huge review, actually, almost 300 studies on this very topic.
Yeah.
And one of the first things that jumped out, at least for me, was how crucial engagement really is in early childhood. I mean, we always talk about it like it matters, but this research really drives that home.
It's not just like a nice to have.
Yeah.
It really impacts everything, how they learn, how they get along with other kids, even their relationships with teachers. It's even been linked to better academic outcomes later on.
Exactly, and like their well-being overall. So for anyone listening, I mean, if you really want to understand what makes a high-quality early learning environment, paying attention to how researchers measure this engagement thing, it's like a cheat sheet to what they consider important.
Exactly, exactly. So that's exactly what we're going to do in this deep dive. We're going to unpack how researchers define child engagement and probably even more important, how they try to measure it. And spoiler alert, it's way more complicated than you might think.
Yeah, way more complicated. In fact, one of the first things that kind of threw me off is that a lot of studies, like a surprising amount, they don't even clearly define what they mean by engagement.
Yeah, almost two-thirds of the studies in this review didn't have an explicit definition.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, and it's not just being nitpicky. I mean, if we're not all talking about the same thing, using the same language, how can we really compare results across different studies? It's like we're trying to build a puzzle with pieces from different sets.
And it gets even trickier when you bring in the idea of involvement too, right? Like in everyday conversation, they seem pretty interchangeable.
Yeah, but research tends to draw a line. Engagement is often about what you can see, the behaviors, the interactions, while involvement is more about that inner experience, what's happening in the child's head and heart.
Yeah.
But even that distinction, it can get kind of blurry.
Yeah, the review even pointed out some instances where the definitions were almost circular, like defining engagement as part of involvement and then defining involvement with engagement. It's like,
Yeah, like a dog chasing its tail.
exactly. It makes your head spin a little. And speaking of definitions, I noticed that for older kids, they often break down engagement into these three parts: behavioral, cognitive, and emotional. But is that really the best way to think about it for like toddlers and preschoolers?
Right, that's a good question. I mean, with older kids, you can actually ask them, right? How
Yep.
do you feel about this? But with little kids, you have to kind of guess what's going on inside based on what you see. And that's not always accurate, right? Like a toddler might be totally zoned in on a puzzle, but we don't really know what's happening in their mind, how deep that cognitive engagement really is.
So we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg, really.
Yeah, and that's, I think, part of what makes measuring engagement in early childhood so tricky. It's this blend of external and internal, and we can't really fully access the internal part, at least not directly.
And getting the kids to tell us directly, that's got to be a challenge too, right?
Oh, huge challenge. I mean, self-reporting, like using surveys, it works okay with older kids, but little kids, their language is still developing. They don't always understand abstract concepts. And then you've got, you know, what researchers call response bias. Like a kid might just always point to the smiley face, even if they're not actually feeling happy.
They just like the smiley face.
Right. So it's not a reliable way to get at their actual experience.
And then on top of all that, you've got just the individual differences between kids and how fast they're developing, right? It's like trying to hit a moving target.
Definitely. Every kid develops at their own pace. They have different personalities, different ways of expressing themselves. What looks like engagement in one child might be totally different in another. And they're changing so rapidly, like what's true today might not be true tomorrow. So capturing engagement in a meaningful way, it's a real challenge.
And the environments themselves, early childhood settings, they're so different from like a traditional school classroom, right? That has to make it even harder to measure consistently.
Oh, absolutely. Think about it. You've got messy play, you've got running around, you've got quiet time, you've got teacher-led activities. It's so diverse. So how do you create a measurement tool that works across all those different contexts? And then, layer on top of that the differences between countries, how ECC is structured in different places. It's like comparing apples and oranges or, I don't know, apples and elephants.
And then there's this whole other layer of complexity that the review talked about: temporality. Is engagement like a fleeting moment or a more stable trait?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Some researchers, they see engagement as this in-the-moment thing. You're engaged right now, but maybe not in 5 minutes. Others see it as more of a personality characteristic, a tendency to be engaged across different situations and over time. And that assumption really shapes how they choose to measure it. If it's a fleeting thing, they're going to use observations to catch those moments. If it's more stable, they might use questionnaires to get at those longer-term patterns.
Makes sense. So let's get into some specifics. How are researchers actually conceptualizing this thing called engagement? The review broke it down into a few different categories, starting with engagement in academic activities.
Right. So a lot of studies, especially in the U.S., they focus on how engaged kids are in activities that have like a clear academic goal, learning letters, counting, stuff like that. And this framework from Fredericks and her colleagues back in 2004, it's been pretty influential here. It looks at engagement from those three angles: behavioral, emotional, and cognitive.
So for the behavioral part, when we're talking about young kids in these academic settings, what are they actually looking for?
It's mostly about what you can see, right? Paying attention to the teacher, participating in activities, raising their hand, answering questions, staying focused on the task, things like effort, persistence, following instructions, finishing their work, that kind of stuff.
So not just like saying they're curious, but actually showing curiosity through their actions.
Exactly, exactly. And it's interesting because they did note that sometimes emotion words do pop up in these descriptions, but they're always linked to something observable. Like instead of saying the child is enthusiastic, they might say the child is demonstrating enthusiasm.
So it's still about what you can see, not just what you assume they're feeling.
Right. And as for the cognitive side of things, well, it gets a little trickier. Those internal aspects like attitudes toward learning or how connected they feel to the material, those aren't always included in the definitions when we're talking about young kids. And same goes for their underlying abilities like executive function or social emotional skills. Those aren't always explicitly factored in either.
Yeah, it makes sense. Those things are much harder to measure directly, especially in little kids.
Right. So that's kind of the academic engagement side of things.
Yeah.
But then there's also general child engagement, which takes a much wider view.
Right. So how's that different?
Well, general child engagement is about how involved they are across all kinds of activities, not just academic ones. And there's this really popular definition from McWilliam and Bailey. They talk about engagement as the amount of time kids spend interacting with their environment in a way that's developmentally appropriate. And that includes the social environment, so interactions with adults and other kids, and the physical environment, like playing with materials and exploring their surroundings.
Okay, so it's more holistic.
Yeah, much more holistic. And again, the focus is still largely on observable behaviors. Are they paying attention? Are they following the rules? Are they sticking with tasks even when it gets tough? Are they showing self-control? Things like that.
So even when they mention like a cognitive element, it's usually tied to something you can actually see, like focused attention or active listening.
Exactly. Exactly. And then there's child involvement, which is a little different. This is where Laver's work comes in. He really emphasized the quality of the engagement, the inner experience of the child.
Oh, interesting. So how does he define it?
So for Lavers, it's about deep concentration, that feeling of being totally absorbed in what you're doing, like you're in the zone. It's about being motivated from within, finding personal meaning in the activity and having this like energy and joy around it. It's less about what you can see on the surface and more about that spark inside.
It's like that feeling of flow that people talk about.
Exactly. Exactly. And then just to throw even more terms at you, there's also task engagement, joint engagement, play engagement, peer engagement.
Whoa. Okay, hold on. That's a lot of engagement.
I know, right? And there's even negative engagement, which is about those, less desirable behaviors, like being disruptive or aggressive. But the interesting thing is, for all the talk about social development, the review actually found that there's no really clear definition of social engagement in the research, which is kind of surprising given how important social skills are in early childhood.
Yeah, that is surprising. So it seems like there's this huge range of ways to think about engagement, but did the review find any kind of common theoretical frameworks that researchers are using to guide their work?
Surprisingly, not really. Explicit frameworks were kind of rare. They did mention Bronfenbrenner's bioecological model, which is about how kids develop within these nested systems of influence, like their family, their community, the wider society.
Right.
Now, that makes sense, right? Engagement doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's influenced by all these layers of the environment. And for academic engagement, some studies use self-determination theory, which is all about how feeling confident, autonomous, and connected can boost kids' intrinsic motivation, which then leads to more engagement. And for involvement, they linked it to Csikszentmihalyi's idea of flow and Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. And it's interesting, they also mentioned attachment theory when looking at the role of teachers in fostering engagement.
So even though there's no one, like, dominant theory, there are these threads that connect to these broader ideas about child development.
Exactly. Okay, so we've talked about how researchers define engagement, but how do they actually measure it? Get down to the nitty-gritty.
Yeah, let's get into that. The review mentioned two main categories: observations and surveys, right?
Right. And observations, hands down, that's the most common method. It's all about watching kids in their natural environment and trying to capture those moments of engagement.
And who's doing the observing?
Usually it's external observers, either the researchers themselves or people they've trained. But here's the thing. A lot of studies didn't give much detail about the observers' qualifications or their training, which is, a little concerning. If we don't know who these people are or what kind of training they've had, it makes it hard to trust the data, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. You want to know if the people collecting the data are, like, competent and unbiased?
Exactly. And in terms of what the observations look like, well, it varies a lot. Most studies used multiple observations over several days, which is good. You get a more complete picture that way. And when it came to recording what they saw, they mostly used direct coding, meaning the observer is like checking boxes or taking notes in real time rather than using video recordings to analyze later.
Hmm.
And the length of the observation sessions, that could be anything from super short intervals, like 10 or 15 seconds, to much longer periods.
So they're catching these, like, snapshots of engagement over time.
Yeah, exactly. And the review found a ton of different established measures, like 77 in total.
Wow, that's a lot.
Right. And established just means it's been published and used in research, doesn't necessarily mean it's been rigorously tested or anything. And a lot of these measures, they weren't even specifically designed to measure engagement. It was just one part of a bigger observation protocol. And only about a third of them actually said anything about observer training being required.
So there's a lot of, like, potential for inconsistency there.
Yeah, definitely. And of course, there are also measures specifically for looking at group engagement, like how engaged is the whole class in an activity. And the way engagement is rated, well, some use scales, low to high, and some just use a simple engaged, not engaged category. And it's less common for them to actually describe the specific activity the child was engaged in. It's more about the level of engagement itself.
So there's this focus on the how of engagement, not necessarily the what.
Right. And then you've got the unestablished measures, which are basically tools that researchers created themselves for a specific study. And those are even more variable. Some use really objective criteria, like where the child is looking or what they're touching, but others use much more subjective language, like whether the behavior is appropriate or purposeful, which, opens the door to all kinds of bias.
So it's like one researcher's purposeful might be another researcher's distracted.
Exactly. So that's observations. Then you've got surveys, which, as you might guess, are less common with young kids because, they can't really fill out a questionnaire. So most of the time, it's teachers filling out surveys, sometimes parents. The review found 26 established survey measures. And again, engagement was often just one part of a bigger survey. And teacher surveys were particularly popular for measuring academic engagement, which makes sense, right? They're the ones who see how kids are interacting with those academic activities day in and day out.
They've got the front row seat.
Exactly. And then there were a couple of other, less common methods. One study used what's called the sociometric method, where they ask kids who they like to play with and use that as a way to measure social engagement. And another study just had teachers categorize kids into different engagement groups, which is super simple, but also super subjective.
Yeah, a lot riding on the teacher's perception there.
Exactly. So overall, it's clear that there's no one right way to measure engagement. There's this huge range of approaches, and that can make it hard to compare findings across studies and really get a clear picture of what's going on.
Okay, so big picture. What are some of the key takeaways from this review? What do they recommend for moving the field forward?
Well, the biggest thing is we need more clarity. Researchers need to be super clear about what they mean by engagement, like actually spell it out in their studies. We can't just assume everyone's on the same page.
Yeah, define your terms.
Exactly. And not only define them, but make sure the way you're measuring engagement actually aligns with your definition. You're talking about internal motivation, but you're only measuring how long a kid sits still. Well, those two things might not match up.
So it's about being really intentional with your methods.
Yes, and being transparent about those methods too. The review was pretty clear about the need for better reporting. Tell us who your observers are, what training they had, how long the observations were, all that stuff. That helps other researchers evaluate the quality of your research and build on it.
Makes sense. It's about building that trust and transparency in the field.
And they also pushed for using validated measures whenever possible, tools that have been rigorously tested and shown to be accurate. Don't just rely on something that sounds good on the surface. Actually do the work to make sure it's measuring what you think it's measuring.
Don't cut corners.
Right. And they also pointed out that this whole three-part model of engagement, behavioral, emotional, cognitive, that might not work so well for young kids, especially the emotional and cognitive parts, because those are so hard to measure directly.
Yeah, especially if you're only focusing on what you can see.
Exactly. And it could mean we're missing out on the engagement of kids who are like more introverted or who express themselves in less obvious ways.
The quiet thinkers.
Right, the quiet thinkers. And finally, they suggested that we need to get better at capturing kids' own perspectives, actually asking them what they're thinking and feeling. And that's tough with little kids, but they pointed to some examples in other areas of research where they've been able to use like simplified scales or visual aids to get feedback from young children.
So there's potential there. It just needs more exploration.
Exactly. So I know we've covered a lot, but the big takeaway here is that measuring child engagement, it's not as simple as it seems. There's so much variation in how it's defined and measured, and that has implications for how we interpret the research and ultimately how we design better learning experiences for kids.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even something as seemingly straightforward as engagement can be really nuanced and complex.
Absolutely. And,
Yeah.
and I think it leaves us with this really interesting question. Given how much we rely on observing behavior, are we really capturing the full picture of a child's engagement? Or are we missing those internal sparks of curiosity, motivation, and deep thinking that might not always be visible? And how can we get better at capturing those internal experiences, especially in young children? That's a challenge for the future of research in this area.
It is. It's a reminder that there's always more to learn, always more to explore, and that kids, especially little kids, are full of surprises.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for this deep dive. It's been really eye-opening.
My pleasure. Always fun to geek out about early childhood research.
And to all our listeners, keep those questions coming and keep diving deep into the fascinating world of early childhood.
Yes, keep diving.
All right, until next time.